Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Film Buds podcast. This is episode number 286, and my name's Henry. Just me this week, but Elle should be back next week. This time around, I'm going to be doing something a little unexpected, but I guess that's to be expected with this show. I'm going to be doing a NC-17 double feature. There aren't many NC-17 rated films that come out these days, or really ever. And for the most part, it's only because of sexual content. I mean, if you think of the most violent, gruesome, gory horror films out there, none of them get an NC-17 rating just for the violence. It's always really due to sexual content, nudity, all of that. So figured it would be a little bit of a interesting. So I figured it would be a pretty interesting conversation. And I think both of these movies are quite unique in their own ways, besides just being NC-17 rated. But first, I'm going to be doing Lars von Trier's Nymphomaniac, volumes 1 and 2. He released it in 2 parts because the director's cuts together are about 5-ish hours. And then I'm also going to be doing a review of the French film Blue is the Warmest Color. Both came out in 2013, so about 10 years ago now, which is crazy to think about, but it should be a great time. And then I have some other stuff I watched, all of the usual stuff. So thanks as always for joining us. Please make sure to hit that subscribe button if you have not yet. Thank you to all of our new listeners. We've been having an increase still in some new listenership, so we really do appreciate that, and keep it up. Give us a rating, give us a review, a share on social media, all that good stuff. We really do appreciate it. Well, not a whole lot to mention. I guess that's pretty customary with me. Sadly, I'm sorry I'm boring, but I can't remember if we were talking about it last week or maybe the week before when I was by myself. But we are trying to figure out some vacation time in the next couple of months. Film Buds won't be affected, but we are trying to get out of New Mexico because we've pretty much been stuck here for a while. We haven't really had much chance for a vacation, so we are looking at doing that. Probably going back home to North Carolina. We haven't been back home to see family or old friends, anything like that for quite some time. So looking forward to that, hoping it works out. It's always difficult to coordinate leave and all that, especially with my work schedule and then Elle's work schedule. It's very hard to get it all sorted, but hopefully that'll happen. We're planning on road tripping with our 3 dogs, which will be the longest road trip we've ever taken in our whole lives, not just when we've been married, but our whole lives. So that should be an interesting time, and we'll definitely do some post-road trip discussions and stories and all that good stuff. So keep an eye out for that. Well, not a whole lot else to say. As always, if you have not checked out our bonus show page, go to filmbuds.bandcamp.com, and that is in the show notes as well. We have about 65 plus bonus shows covering directors, actors, genres, franchises, all that good stuff. And if you have any suggestions for ideas for bonus shows, please let us know on social media at FilmBuds, on Letterboxd, email, and again, all that stuff is in the show notes. So please let us know any thoughts, comments, constructive criticisms that you'd like to send our way. We'd love to hear from you. All right, well, I do have a lot to talk about here, so let's go ahead and get into the first movie, which is Nymphomaniac. And as luck would have it, do have a clip, so take a listen.
I'm willing to give you 5 extra points if you can get that one in there.
I decided, perhaps a bit desperately, that the only thing standing between me and the bag of chocolate sweets was an unequivocal provocation of this man.
All right, so Nymphomaniac came out in 2013, and now they are 2 films technically in how they were released. So I will be talking about each one in terms of their own plots and differences and all that, but I guess I will just be doing a full discussion of them together as one because it is one singular story. It's just because of the runtime, it was cut into 2 parts. It's directed by Lars von Trier, stars Charlotte Gainsbourg, Stellan Skarsgård, Stacey Martin, Shia LaBeouf, Christian Slater, Jamie Bell, Uma Thurman, Willem Dafoe, Mia Goth, and many others. And the synopsis is, Joe, a self-diagnosed nymphomaniac who is discovered badly beaten in an alley by an older bachelor, Seligman, who takes her into his home. As he tends to her wounds, she recounts the erotic story of her adolescence and young adulthood. Together, this one made about 18 million against a budget of around 5, so not really a big hit, but Lars von Trier has never really been a big box office success. He's very art house, and for anyone who is unfamiliar with him, I think it's fair to say he's a pretentious filmmaker in his style, and I don't mean pretentious as inherently a bad thing. I don't mind something being pretentious from time to time, because if you don't go so far out there, if you don't stretch the boundaries, you won't ever have any growth in art. And so that isn't an excuse for any choice they make is perfect, because it's not. But when I say something is pretentious, I don't inherently mean it's a bad thing. Sometimes it is. And I think even in this, there are times where I would call the pretension a bad thing. But he is someone who is it's very European. It's quite dark, depressing. I don't know if misery porn is the right way to put it, but there are points where maybe you could call it that. He is very, very, very realistic human stories, and yet they're often told in a surrealist kind of way. Not really in this as much, but in some of his others, if you want to check those out. He is a very unique filmmaker, for better and for worse, and he's not one for everyone. So he's not the crowd pleaser. He's not the blockbuster filmmaker. He's a very, very art house in the most intense meaning of the word. So I had heard about this movie around the time that it came out, because I was just getting into movies at the time in a more serious way in those last couple of years. Didn't really know anything about Lars von Trier. I knew some of the people in this cast, but I don't think I saw it until a couple of years later, because I think it honestly kind of scared me. I was like, I don't know if I can handle that kind of movie. I didn't know much about it. I was and considering it was about 5 hours long, I was like, I just don't think I have the commitment for that. But before I watched it, I believe I saw a couple of his other films, and I don't love all of his movies across the board. I'll always watch what he does just because he has a very unique voice. But this one always stuck in my mind, and I finally did get around to watching it, and I've now rewatching it now. I've seen it twice all the way through, because he's not really one that you want to rewatch a lot of his movies. They're so dark and depressing and dour that one and done is often the way to go. When it comes to, I guess, sexual addiction films, or just addiction in general, I'm pretty drawn to that kind of stuff, because even though it's a depressing topic, it makes for pretty interesting cinematic stories. Like Shame with Michael Fassbender is one of the best ones in terms of at least of sexual addiction. There's a comedic version, which is Don John, the Joseph Gordon-Levitt film. That's a really great movie. So, and not just sexual addiction, there's plenty of other movies about addiction one way or the other. But I think when it comes to sexual addiction, porn addiction, whatever, I think that's a pretty interesting, at times unsettling story to tell. But it is important because it is real, and it does happen, and it does affect people. And I think in this, despite the very stylish, extended storytelling of this movie, there's nothing else really like it. And I would say that's the case for most Lars von Trier movies. But of all of his movies, this is the one that sticks out to me the most in that way. It's probably my favorite, maybe alongside The House That Jack Built. That's a great one. I'll check that out if you haven't seen it yet. The movie, he has the ability, not to say it's a bad thing, he has the ability to make anything depressing. Not to say that addiction is something to be laughed about or to be comedic, but there are obviously ways of, as with Don John, there are ways of telling a comedic story. And I think there's a time and place for both a serious story and a comedic story on the subject matter. But he has the ability in this to make an NC-17 very graphic, where I think all of the penises that you see are prosthetics. I could be wrong there, but I think that's what I read. And he has the ability to make scenes that I guess in some ways might be stimulating for some to be unsettling, gross, disturbing, uncomfortable, any of those words. I mean, you see full frontal nudity, vaginas, penises, boobs, everything. And usually you see people having orgasms, and it's full frontal. You see upfront pictures of genitalia. It's pretty graphic, and I'm able to take a lot of graphic content in movies. I don't really care about that. I'm not really affected by that, but there are points, especially towards the end, where he's actually having cross-cutting and split screens of different sex scenes and genitalia, where someone is telling a story, recounting a story, and you're seeing things, very real. So it's definitely pushes the boundaries in all those ways and very much earns its NC-17 rating. But at the same time, it's not one where you'd go watch it to get like your rocks off or something. It's very depressing, and he doesn't make sex look fun or interesting because, as it should be, he's telling the story of an addiction where it's really ruined someone's life, where they can't control it. It drives their whole life. It ruins relationships. It ruins friendships, family members. But nevertheless, it is quite well told. I do find that, and I'll talk about when I do part 2, but I don't think I needed the movie to be 5 hours. I think there are parts in, if he had maybe condensed part 1, I could have done with a 2.5 hour, 3 hour, 1 volume movie. I don't mind inherently that it's 5 hours. That's in its own way ambitious and gutsy, and there's a lot of rich storytelling there. But at the same time, it is flawed, partly because of the runtime. The cast is pretty great across the board. The biggest thing, though, and I did talk about this on my Letterboxd review, and I think a lot of people responded to it, is Shia LaBeouf, who it is really sad considering his personal life has really tarnished his career and his reputation, because I love Shia LaBeouf. I grew up watching Transformers and Holes, and I think he's really done some fantastic performances over the last decade. So it's really sad that he has been tarnished for many reasons. There is no reason for his character in this movie to be British. I understand that it takes place in England, at least partly, but we know watching it, anyone watching it knows it's Shia LaBeouf. We know he's not English, and anyone who knows, most American actors cannot do English accents convincingly, but vice versa, they can. English actors generally can do American accents quite well. But in this, his accent is so distracting, it's inconsistent, he's one of the main characters, so he's not just in and out, and you're like, oh, well, that was a little unconvincing, but okay, whatever. He's one of the central characters, and then other characters are speaking in an American accent who are American, who we know are American, just like Shia, and for some reason he had to be English in this, and I don't understand that, because it ruins that part of the movie in terms of authenticity. He easily could have been an American character living in London. And so I think that was the worst choice of the whole movie. There's no reason for it. It doesn't add anything to the character. There's no mention or alluding to him not being who he says he is or anything like that. It's just he's meant to be English, and I really don't understand that. So that is by far the biggest issue. Not a deal breaker, but that is the thing that always sticks out to me. It's so frustrating. Every time I watch it, I'm like, okay, I'm loving this. I'm so invested in these characters. And then Shia LaBeouf pops in, and it's like, all right, I know you're not English. I know you're not. So that's a shame. But otherwise, the movie does really do a great job because it is this woman sitting in a bed telling Stellan Skarsgård about her addiction story from when she grew up as a kid to where she is now. And in this, the major, which I really connected with, and I think it feels very grounded and realistic, is towards the end of the movie, there's the heartbreaking extended sequence of her father, played by Christian Slater, dying in the hospital, slowly, his body and mind completely going, her having breakdowns and basically using sex as an escape, saying, hey, nurse or doctor, please have sex with me, essentially. Because it's this 20-30 minute sequence where her father is losing his mind, he's dying, and they can't do anything to stop it. She's just having to watch her father die in front of her and not be able to do anything, not have anyone else around her. And so she is just using sex as a means of escape. And that in some ways drives the addiction in terms of whenever she's depressed, alone, bam, that's her go-to. And so I think that really hits home. I think I think everyone has an addiction of some kind, but that is something that, whether it's art, whether someone's a sex addict, an alcoholic, anything like that, feels very true to form in terms of someone growing up, going through some horrible traumatic event or a sequence of events and developing some kind of escape that isn't necessarily healthy. And so I think that is something that really does make it feel not pretentious. It does make it feel like, all right, you could easily see this happening. So in terms of the actual telling and the quote unquote research and realism of the movie, it's second to none. There's nothing else really like, besides, I would say, shame. The performances across the board are all quite solid, aside from Shia. That's just, again, too bad. Charlotte Gainsbourg, I like her in general. I don't seek her movies out. I don't go out of my way to see her movies. She's good in it. I do find in the second part that her performance becomes repetitive because in the first film or the first volume, she's very monotone in her storytelling. Like, then I had this, and then I had sex, and then this happened, and then this. And it makes sense in that way because she's been beaten down, she's depressed, she's doing her best to recount this horrible trauma of her whole life. So I get that. But in the second movie, when it cuts to flashbacks, it's her. But in the first film, when it cuts to flashbacks, it's not her playing that part. It's a younger actress. And in the second part, it gets to the point where it is her. And so you're stuck with the entire movie of that dreary, monotonous style. And that does grow repetitive at times. I understand the artistic choice, but that's one of the main reasons why I don't believe the 2-volume decision was the absolute best way to go about it. But Uma Thurman is insane in this. The sequence where she comes to the young Charlotte Gainsbourg's apartment and she's been sleeping with Uma Thurman's husband. And Uma Thurman is basically, she's aware of it. She comes in there with her kids and has a complete mental breakdown. Oh, let's go see the bedroom where it happened. Let's go see this. And she starts screaming and just wailing and losing everything. I think that performance is crazy. And she's a very underrated actor to me. And she's really good in The House That Jack Built, the other Lars von Trier movie. And she's great in general. Stellan Skarsgård is all around good. He's always great in everything. Jamie Bell, who only pops up in the second part, is one of his best as well. So Lars von Trier, even though I don't love all his movies, I wouldn't really recommend his movies to a lot of people. He gets great performances 9 times out of 10, more so than a lot of other filmmakers and a lot of other art house filmmakers. So the first part of the two, if I had to look at them as 2 parts, which they are, but looking at them in that way, the first part is my favorite because there is that break from Charlotte Gainsbourg and you seeing a younger actress play most of the movie for her, as opposed to the second part where it's only Charlotte Gainsbourg, really. So that works better. I also like the origin story of all of it. That's a little bit more engaging and intriguing for me, as opposed to the really depressing adult life part of the addiction where it's still going and going and going and it's getting worse. And so cinematically, emotionally, the first part works for me better, even just the pacing. And I don't know how some people feel about it, but the idea of Stellan Skarsgård having no knowledge of this world of nymphomania, and the only way that he's able to relate to her is talking about fly fishing. And I don't think that's meant to be taken fully seriously. Like, I think that's okay to see as funny because he's this older bachelor, as the synopsis says. He doesn't know anything about this girl, nymphomania, nothing. And so when she tells a story about having sex with a guy or a random person, or how she seduced strange men on a train or something, he's like, well, that's interesting because when I'm fly fishing, this and that. And so that's a pretty both completely realistic way of connecting with someone where I don't know anything about you or what you deal with. This is the only thing I can say that could marginally even relate to your experience or to understand it. But then it's also funny in a way because you're going from this very graphic NC-17 sex story to, well, when you're fly fishing and you want to catch the fish like this, do this. And so I think that's a very interesting choice, and it works on a lot of different levels. So I really enjoyed that. The script is very well written, in my opinion, and is by far, whether it's for many people or not, is one of the best addiction stories I've ever seen in film, especially considering the length, even though it doesn't totally work because of the length. And I'll go ahead and jump into part 2 in just a little bit. I'm just going to keep the ball rolling. It is a movie worth watching. I think you could probably watch the first part and get enough out of it where you wouldn't really feel the need to watch part 2. I think there's enough there, and maybe that's a criticism of the movie. But even though I still will always watch both parts if I'm going to sit down and watch it, which is not very regular, it is still worth watching if you like art house, if you like addiction stories, if you just want to watch a really, really challenging, dark, visceral character piece. It's one of the best, in my opinion, in terms of that style and that genre, so to speak. Not for everyone. it is NC-17, so very graphic, I think even for the most experienced of moviegoers. But nevertheless, despite the few flaws and some of the other issues that I have with it as a whole, it is an incredibly unique and original type of film, and there's nothing else really like it, as I've said. So it is worth a watch. Just be ready for it. So I guess I'll go and rate both pieces just because it is separated into 2 volumes. So I'll give that one a 4 out of 5. All right, well, Volume 2 came out 2013, same year. Has a few extra cast members, Jamie Bell, Willem Dafoe, Mia Goth, a couple others. And this one, basically, I won't do a synopsis because it basically is just a continuing story, but her more so as an adult rather than a toddler, a teenager, early 20s. It's her late 20s, 30s, however old she is. And as I said earlier, this to me is the weaker volume. While I'm still always engaged with it, and I would recommend, if you're going to watch it, it's already 4.5, 5 hours. I would watch the director's cuts if you can find those, because if you're already sitting down for that amount of time, you might as well watch all that's there. So I would seek out the director's cuts. They're available in a few different places. So this one is longer. The director's cut is almost 3 hours. And biggest issue that I was talking about earlier is the monotonous feeling of Charlotte Gainsbourg's performance, where you aren't getting a break of that drony, monotonous style of her delivery, which that would be my biggest criticism of this volume. But otherwise, it's very, very in-depth. It's an incredibly rich yet depressing, disturbing, unsettling portrayal of nymphomania, sex addiction, and Jamie Bell in this, amazing. I love him across the board. I think he's an incredibly underrated actor. His character, where he is basically taking these women in this almost sterile laboratory office kind of place and then abusing them because they want him to. And it's really uncomfortable to watch. It's really disturbing, violent, physical. And then he's also, at the same time, very soft-spoken, but there's also an extreme violence to it. That's probably the best part of the movie, despite the unsettling nature of it. Mia Goth, I love. I think she's one of the most interesting up-and-coming actors in Hollywood right now. I cannot wait to see what she does from here on. I first saw her in A Cure for Wellness. I believe that was her breakout role, but I love her. I love her in the X, Pearl trilogy, and there's more of those to come. I love those movies. I think she's amazing. There's the Sex Addicts Anonymous meetings, like almost like AA in a way, where she's trying to, and this also gets into the commentary on the actual nymphomania mentality and sex addiction, all those mixtures of things, where she at times wants to get help. She's lost all of her sexual sensation at a certain point in the movie. She's married to Shia LaBeouf as well, and Shia LaBeouf is even letting her go out to sleep with other people to try and get her energy and feeling going again. But what's interesting to me in this is showing how someone who actually wants to get help, or maybe is attempting to get help, the medical system and the anonymous group meetings and therapy, whatever else, isn't really that equipped to help them. Yeah, they can sit there and talk about their problems, but really, is that going to do anything to really cure the problem? Probably not most of the time. Maybe in some ways it does. Maybe for some people. I'm not criticizing those groups because I have no knowledge, no experience of that. But in the context of the movie, she really sees it as very little help. She's not feeling that understood. She's feeling at times even more outcast. At least that's how I felt about it. And so I think that's interesting. It's not super deep in terms of that commentary, but the idea of someone trying to get help for an addiction and not really finding a place where they're truly going to be able to get improvement and great advice and changes. So that's interesting. And also another depressing, dour part of the film. There's not much humor at all in the movie. So overall, the movie is solid. It is worth a watch. If you watch the first part, might as well watch the second part. But if I had to pick which when I liked more, it would be the first one by a little bit. This one is just too long, I find, and the director's cut is even more so to that point. There are chunks of the movie that become repetitive. Misery porn, as I mentioned earlier, it hits you over the head time after time after time after time, where I feel like I'm thinking, all right, I get it. Not to say that other parts of the movie aren't important, or there aren't ideas or good performances or anything like that, or it's bad just in general. But there are times where I'm thinking, all right, kind of ready to wrap this up. I've seen 3, 4, 5 hours of this. I understand it enough, but maybe in some ways that's the point of an addiction. You can't really escape it and might as well tell every detail of it. I get it. But nevertheless, there are points where I tire somewhat. The ending, Lars von Trier in general is very cynical in his storytelling. There's not a lot of hope and inspiration. It's typically the opposite. I do find that the ending scene where Stellan Skarsgård, spoiler here, when she finishes the story, there's this brief break and he actually is then trying to rape her, and she ends up getting away from him and races out, and that's basically the end of the movie. And so it does go into that cynical nature of someone being darkly or secretly intrigued by, especially when it comes to sexual ideas and stories and concepts, someone being secretly intrigued by that stuff, as maybe Lars von Trier is. Maybe that's obvious. And then also just the mentality of men when it comes to nymphomania and the difference between men and women. So it's a very interesting movie. If you can deal with the very personal, traumatic nature of the storytelling, it is absolutely worth a watch for sure. Both parts, just you gotta, I don't know if I could watch both parts right after each other. When I rewatched them just recently, I watched them a couple of days apart just because they're so dark. But check out Lars von Trier if you haven't. There's a lot of interesting, very unique movies and stories to experience there. So he is a very out there filmmaker, not for everyone, like I said, but a very one of a kind auteur director for sure. So I would give that one a 3.5 out of 5. All right. Well, with that done, let's get to our other review, which is Blue is the Warmest Color. And this one is in French, so I won't be doing a clip, but it also came out in 2013, directed by Abdellatif Kechiche. Sorry if I butchered that name. Sure I did. Stars Léa Seydoux, Adele Exarchopoulos. Sorry if I butchered that. I'm sure I did. Once again. And the synopsis is, Adele's life is changed when she meets Emma, a young woman with blue hair who will allow her to discover desire and to assert herself as a woman and as an adult. In front of others, Adele grows, seeks herself, loses herself, and ultimately finds herself through love and loss. This one made 19 million against a budget of around 4. So an indie movie for sure, but did very, very well critically. And I remember when this one came out, within just a couple of months of Nymphomaniac, made its rounds at the festivals and has, in my opinion, maybe I'm telling tales out of school here, but has had quite a shelf life. When I first saw it, I have seen it 3 or 4 times now over the years. The movie is amazing. It's an amazing story about someone questioning their sexuality, experiencing different things, not knowing who they are. And so in that respect, it's great. But just as a general romance story, it's amazing as well. And is by far one of the most natural, realistic, I don't know if easily digestible is the right term, but incredibly watchable films, coming of age stories that I've ever seen. And I rewatched it just in the last week, and I was blown away by how good it still is. Adele's character and the direction is partly to praise there, but her performance and that direction, you feel like you're watching a real person. You aren't thinking, or at least I wasn't thinking, I'm watching an actor play this character, because the camera is always on her, and the movie's 3 hours. But what I felt when I was going in this last viewing, I was thinking, oh man, I am worried that this movie is going to drag. It's 3 hours long. Am I going to get bored of this an hour in? And I could not believe how quickly it went by. It does not feel like a 3-hour movie. It feels more like 2, because the movie, there's not much plot, if any plot. It's just their lives. And so it's rich in detail, not in plot. And so that helps it, because as I was getting to a second ago, the camera is always on her, on Adele, or in most of the time it is. You're seeing every reaction, her when she gets angry, when she gets sad, when she's talking, when someone else is talking to her, all of those things. So you feel like you're really getting to know this person. And talking about coming of age, indie dramas, character dramas, anything along those lines, it's hard to find a more in-depth, real, natural film than this one is. And Léa Seydoux is amazing in everything. I think this was one of her big breakouts, and then she's gone on to be in a lot of American films like Spectre and some other big movies. She's amazing in it, but Adele's, that characterization, one thing I mentioned on my Letterboxd review is when she's eating pasta at her family's house and she's taking off her coat because she's so excited and into the food she's eating, could not find a more relatable thing for me in a movie in terms of little human moments. Because, you know, when you're getting ready to eat something really, really good, or you're loving something, you might get a little hot or excited and you like, oh, I got to get ready to eat this food. It's going to be amazing. And there are a million moments like that where you feel, again, you're watching Adele, the real person, not a movie character. And her battle with her friends towards the beginning of the movie in high school, where she's questioning her sexuality, and then her friends call her many derogatory names and accuse her of a lot of things. And then that just breaks up relationships and friendships. That's all really well done. It feels very natural. Her chemistry with Léa Seydoux, perfect. They're perfect together in every way. And anytime, and it's throughout most of the movie, whenever they're talking about art, they're just having normal conversations about their interests, their tastes, and isn't just with the two women, it's with anyone. They like this kind of music, but not this kind of music. They like reading because it's too dense or it's too light, or all those conversations feel, you could be on a fly in the wall having that conversation with someone. And I had those same conversations. And so the writing, along with the direction, is some of the best I've ever seen for a film like this. And the fact that it's French, I like foreign film in general. I don't have a problem with reading subtitles, but this movie, it gets into such a groove that I wasn't even really thinking that it's a foreign film. So I couldn't say enough about the movie. I think it is one of the best in all of those different ways and genres that I've already mentioned. I think it is a masterpiece. I can understand it might put some people off at first because it's a 3-hour French coming of age movie. It's not for everyone. And I doubt many people are immediately going to get into all the things that I just mentioned. But if it's a movie for you, you give it a chance. It is so satisfying. And there are a million moments really that I could talk about, but one big one is the breakup, the eventual breakup, spoiler, but the breakup sequence where Adele has been sleeping around a little bit and Léa Seydoux, in one way or the other, catches it or knows what's going on. That argument, performance-wise, incredible. But in the direction and the performances, you feel like you're watching a real breakup happen next to you. Because I've seen people break up nearby me in a public area or in private, whatever. And then I've also had breakups myself. And that is one of the most realistic breakup sequences that I've ever seen. And then the after effects of, let's be real, everyone's done this, where you start crying at random times, or you're suddenly left alone. You start crying, you wake up and you start crying, you question everything. And then there's the eventual, let's meet back up and try and work things out. Nope, sorry, still love you, or I still feel this way, but not going to work out, can't do it. And that post-breakup sequence feels, not to beat a dead horse here, is so natural. And I think anyone who's been through a breakup, which should be everyone, I would imagine at a certain age, you surely can relate to that. So I don't find that this has a particularly European vibe or feeling that other audiences of other regions can't relate to, because it is very, very universal in how it's presented here. And then just to look at French culture is great as well. It's not super in depth, but it does feel French in that way, an appreciation and a love and a knowledge of that, obviously. The lead actress, absolutely love her in this. And there are so many tiny moments that make her feel real and true. And she's just someone you're friends with at work or at school or anything like that. It's an amazing movie that I could never really describe well enough. Now, the big thing with this movie, as with Nymphomaniac, it is NC-17. I almost forgot about that, to be honest. If I had to say anything, I understand that it's about a woman exploring her sexuality, but at the same time, it's a man straight man telling the story of a lesbian romance and lesbian sexual experience. So despite me loving the direction 99.9% of the time and it being better than the majority of other movies I watch in a style or movie like this, there is still that male gaze at times where the sex scenes are, I don't need to see them doing a lot of really, really graphic things that I won't go into. I don't need to go into, but there are a few very, very graphic, and they're not uncomfortable. They're meant to be quite erotic, in my opinion. They're not meant to be like Nymphomaniac, but nevertheless, it is hard to ignore the fact that it is a straight man telling the story of these two women falling in love and exploring things. So I don't think the movie needed to be NC-17. I don't find those scenes to be really all that supportive of the rest of the story. I think they could have been fairly regular R-rated sex scenes and I would have gotten the same picture. So in that way, I would criticize it. It's a small part of the movie, considering it's 3 hours long. That is one point where I don't know if a lot of movies need to be NC-17, but I think Nymphomania has more of a motivation to do that as opposed to this, because there are plenty of romance movies that you don't even need to have it be R-rated. But in this, the NC-17 rating, I'm not going to hit on too much. It is what it is. There aren't many that come out these days, so I guess in some ways it's pushing the boundary. But otherwise, it's so engaging, very emotional, very funny, very real, easily watchable, being 3 hours long, which I can't say that often about a 3-hour foreign film. One of the best coming-of-age movies that I've ever seen. One of the best movies of the 2010s, especially after having rewatched it just now and was absolutely in love with it. So if you're not into foreign movies or if you're not into big epic movies or indie movies, I would still give it a try. It's fairly easy to get into. I don't think it's all that distant. And I felt the same way back when I saw it in 2014, 2015. So I would really give it a shot, even if you're a little weary. Prove me wrong. Yeah, so absolute masterpiece in my opinion, just aside from the whole male gaze thing, hard to ignore. So yeah, that is a heavy 5 out of 5. All right, well, with the reviews done, I'm going to end off with some stuff I watched. Seen a handful of things. First, I watched the new film from, I believe, December, Ferrari, starring Adam Driver and directed by Michael Mann, about Enzo Ferrari, the creator of the luxury car, of course. And I don't really, anyone who listens to the show, I'm not a big car guy. I don't really get excited by cool cars. I like cool cars. If I see them, I'm more of a classic car guy, but I don't, cars, automobiles, I'm not really fascinated by that, or I don't feel the need to get a cool car. It's just not my thing. Nothing against it. It's just not who I am. But nevertheless, I find movies about cars and creators and inventors, all that kind of thing, to be pretty interesting, and racing and all that. So in that way, I find it interesting. And I think it makes for good cinematic storytelling. I really like Adam Driver, and the overall cast is very good. Michael Mann is someone who, his early films I haven't seen many of. I love Public Enemies with Johnny Depp. I like Last of the Mohicans. I like Miami Vice, Black Hat, and this one would be probably about on par with Black Hat. It's quite restrained, but the sound design, and anytime there's a racing sequence, it's very, very in your face and full frontal, because Michael Mann clearly has a love of cars and automobiles in general. So the movie is directed very well. Adam Driver is excellent. Penelope Cruz is a very unexpected powerhouse in the movie. I don't think she's bad in other things. I'm not meaning to say that. I just didn't think she'd be as big a part of the movie as she is, and she's excellent. As a whole, it is good. I don't think it's one of my favorites of Michael Mann. There are points where it gets a little dry, a little dragged out, but it's still a very interesting take on someone who I knew nothing about, and really tells the story of this guy who feels like something can go wrong at any moment with his inventions, with his racing and his risk taking, and then also dealing with this, not to spoil it too much, but with his heir and the problems with having an heir to his throne, so to speak. So all that is interesting. Not a masterpiece, not one that I'm going to feel the need to rewatch all that soon, but definitely has some very strong elements to it, and Adam Driver absolutely carries it across the board. So it is worth watching just for him. Then I rewatched My Week with Marilyn, about Marilyn Monroe, starring Michelle Williams as Marilyn. we did talk about Blonde, the movie Blonde, last year. And I am very fascinated with Marilyn Monroe, always have been since probably high school and with classic film stars in general. But she was, of course, a very tragic yet inspiring, fascinating person. And of all the Marilyn Monroe movies out there, this is probably my favorite. It almost is, in some ways, a romantic comedy. Eddie Redmayne, it's one of his best as well, performance-wise. The movie has a very great balance and back and forth of it being comedic and Marilyn Monroe feeling very bright and bubbly and happy, and then her becoming this incredibly worn down, vulnerable woman who is overwhelmed with everything and she just can't get a hold of things while she's trying to make this movie in England. And then Eddie Redmayne is a young, innocent guy who is one of the many people who fell in love with her and happened to have I don't know if affair is the right word, but a bit of a love story for this period of time. And so it's a very accessible story. You don't need to know really anything about the true story to get into it or know anything about Marilyn Monroe. It's very charming and emotional as well. Very easily digestible when it gets heavy and when it's funny. Very well shot and directed. Michelle Williams is incredible as Marilyn Monroe. So it's a very underrated, maybe some people find it to be middle of the road, I don't know, but ever since I saw it in theaters for the first time, I was in love with it. And so I think it's a very underrated biopic comedy drama. And so I would definitely check it out. And then I also watched, ending off here, I watched Gladiator for the first time, the Ridley Scott epic with Russell Crowe, which I had never seen. I love historical epics. That's obvious to anyone who listens to the show. I'm eat 'em up. And this is really the only Ridley Scott epic that I had not seen to this point. I've been meaning to watch it for years, just never got around to it. And maybe hot take, I enjoy it. It's solid, but it would probably be towards the bottom of my list of ranking for his epics. Most of his ones that he's done since, I like more. And maybe I got to this one too late. I'm not sure, and I know that a lot of these movies, it's very, very subjectable in terms of which ones you connect with and which ones you don't. But for whatever reason, I felt very distant to this movie. I didn't even really love Russell Crowe all that much. I like Joaquin Phoenix a lot, but I found Russell Crowe to be a little frustratingly distant. I understand that's part of the character, but there were still points where I was just thinking, I don't care that much about this guy. Even from a direction standpoint, well, for the most part, the direction is excellent. Anytime they're in the Coliseum, it's amazing. Ridley Scott has an amazing ability to direct action and historical action very well. But the main detractor that I would point out for a direction standpoint, and it's partly the time, I get it, but anytime there's a dream sequence, I don't like how it looks. I think it looks goofy. It looks dated, way too dated for just being, I think, made in 2000. I don't like that. Nevertheless, as a gladiator epic, historical action epic, it is solid and it is worth watching, and you can see the influence that it's had since. I don't know if overrated is the right word because there are a lot of good elements. It's just not one of my personal favorites of Ridley Scott's, and not one I really feel the need to rewatch, whereas a lot of his others I do. So worth watching. Check it out if you like that kind of thing. And I would be curious how other people feel about it. Maybe, again, I got to it too late, as opposed to if I saw it when it first came out before all the others came out, I feel differently. I don't know, but is what it is. So yeah, well, that is about it. As I said, Elle will be back next week. We have some really cool shows planned, so keep an eye out for that. I'm just doing a bit of a unexpected fill-in episode just because of schedule and all that, so hopefully that makes sense. As always, rate, review, subscribe, hit those buttons right now. Tell your friends. Follow us on Letterboxd, on social media, at FilmBuds, and all of that stuff is in the show notes, as it always is. So please reach out to us, comment, tell us what you like, you don't like, what you'd like to see reviewed. Go to our Bandcamp page at filmbuds.bandcamp.com. All the good FilmBuds stuff. Thanks for being here. Love having you here, and see you next time.